Good morning, everyone. This workshop is focusing on advanced argumentation. It's the second to last workshop. We have one last one remaining on effective prose writing, which I call writing with power. This particular workshop, as its name implies, is dealing with argumentation, and I think in some ways it's the most valuable of the workshops. All of them have their purpose. But when I look at, student writing and think about my 20 years of teaching, kind of all the workshops are focused on one general problem area. And the advanced argumentation is kind of the last workshop that I put together, and it really focuses with, students who were often working hard, but they're writing, B-level essays and they want to be A-level essay writers. So what is it that's holding them back? Usually, the primary reason that they fall short has to do with these nuances relative to structuring their argument. Now, argumentation is a complex business, and there's various components about it. There's many subordinate skills that have to come together. But what I try to do in this workshop is put a spotlight on the key steps that you need to have to make sure that your argument is coherent, flows, and persuades the audience. And I use a lot of concrete examples from former students that had Clio papers that were published in the Clio Student Journal to provide you an example of what really works. So most of you have seen this diagram before. I basically try to show you the various stages that are involved in writing any essay. Obviously, if it's a term paper, reflection essay, maybe the elaboration of the steps will be different, but in any essay or written piece, these steps should be present. So we started off by having you guys thinking about what you wanted to write about within the limit to the parameters of certain case studies. So you had to kind of select a general topic, do some initial historical research, and develop a hypothesis relative to your historical question. Then you did a more in-depth literature review to understand what the historiography of your topic was, and this enabled you to put together a scientific study, a data set that you were going to explore that could answer your historical question. Over the study break, I suggested that you invest in mining your data set, the hard labor of finding the evidence from your primary sources, as setting the stage for the final stage where we arrange the evidence, sharpen our argument in order to persuade the audience. So this is exactly the stage where you're supposed to be. But in talking to various students, it's clear that many of you are behind. You're still actually, you've pretty much have a study that's ready to go, but you haven't necessarily invested a lot of time in cranking out the data. So I'm going to be spending most of my time with workshop argumentation, but I'm going to just have a few slides about data mining, especially for those of you that are struggling with particular types of evidence that you're finding difficult to unpack. And the last essay is going to be focusing on the prose issues, which are also very important. So what is data mining? Data mining is simply my term for how you extract the evidence for your argument from your primary source data set and your secondary sources. So it's, in a way, one of the things that's involved is, of course, taking notes. So you'll find an allusion in a CIA document that's very important. So if you want to go old school, you'd have a note card, you'd write down the information that was there and the source, so it'd be ready to be cited. Now, since we live in a digital age, we often don't use pen and paper. In fact, we don't even have the muscle memory for holding a pen, it seems, in some cases. So you can type this information onto a Word document as well. Often what I will do is I'll have certain categories like Mobutu and September coup, and then under those categories I will group the particular facts as a kind of preliminary stage before building your outline. Essentially what you're doing is going comprehensively through all the evidence, or what you would call in court discovery, and then extracting the data points that are going to be potentially relevant to the case, although not all of those data points are going to be included in your actual argument. Now, another technique is highlighting. Some of you have highlighting pens. If you have, your historiographical papers, maybe for any essay projects, you have 2 or 3 historiographical essays. It could be an introduction of a monograph, could be a book review. What you could do is just highlight the key arguments, and those key arguments you would write onto a page, and in that page would become kind of your historiography paragraph. Now, if you're analyzing a film, a visual source rather than a written source or a correspondence documentary sources you're more familiar with, how do you, take notes on that? Well, one of the ways you could take on notes is you could freeze the film and then do screen capture. Then you have a still image of that particular, film that you could potentially analyze, or it's a data point. It's a very significant scene in which you can analyze the cinematography. You could do a similar thing with a painting. You could blow up a particular icon. Perhaps there's an icon on this art of the Great Spirit, and you want to focus in on how the artist has rendered this and the symbolism that's being used. Another technique involved with mining your data set is potentially mapping out events. The Congo is a massive place, right? It's 80 times the size of Belgium. And you have these events in your documents, but you're not sure where Leopoldville or where's Elizabethville. So what you could do is to have 10 or 12 events and then map them out so you understand where they are in time space. So you understand something about the context and how they are related. Now, if you're doing film analysis, one of the things that you need to do is kind of inventory the data set. So maybe of a film like Metropolis, you're only interested in 25 minutes, or 25 minutes is really the material for your particular historical question. So then you'd have to, kind of essentially record those 12 or 13 scenes. What is the beginning of the scene, what frame, and where does it end? So you just have that as a record, so you can refer to it both in your footnotes and in your analysis. Another exercise we did early in the semester was simply creating a timeline, like a document about Lumumba's assassination can be very significant or less significant depending on its timing. If it's coming way after the order was issued, it might only be referring to mechanics. But if you realize, oh no, this document is very early, it's the first mention of removing Lumumba, this would raise its significance. So one of the things that you need to do when you're writing a history paper is, of course, to establish that timeline as a kind of baseline to understand the event itself. Now, outlining is usually referring to setting up your argument, but mining your data set is kind of the preliminary stage of that. Gathering the data and collecting it in certain baskets before the next stage where you start to outline it. So I see that the data extraction is kind of stage 1, and the outlining is stage 2, where you go from your baskets and start to create your subordinate arguments and the exhibits that you feel are the best evidence for substantiating those subordinate arguments. Now, we live in a digital age, so one of the things you can do is also use various digital tools. For instance, a word cloud. If you're looking at New York Times magazines in a digital edition, you can put it through a word cloud generator to see the amount of references to a particular idea. That might tell you how the society is looking at this event, or to what extent the Congo crisis was on the radar of American newspaper readers. Or if you would do this from the rotonde versus the fulcrum, you might be able to show, well, certain concepts were resonating a lot more among Anglophone students than Francophone students. Another thing you can do is start to group your data into publishable form. So if you are collecting statistics about the amount of women that are registering to attend the University of Ottawa, what you want to do is to create a table where you can show the progression over time to where the university got gender balance. Another thing you might potentially do is I call it concept mapping. The penultimate form would be an infographic. But potentially on a piece of paper or on PowerPoint, what you can do is to arrange particular ideas to kind of sort and unpack those. So, for example, in this particular infographic, a lot of post-colonial leaders were socialists or identified with socialism. So I wanted to highlight how socialism was also, in a way, referenced to various world regions and what were some of these representative leaders of this socialist movement in that particular region. So by creating a concept map, it provides you in a way of mastering the data, figuring out what's there on the road to preparing your argument. Now, many of you have chosen film analysis, and for many of you, it's your first time and kind of working with visual evidence. It has kind of tricks of its own, so there's a little bit of a learning curve here. One of the typical ways that historians analyze these types of texts is through what they call deconstruction. So how would you data mine a film, for example? So I already mentioned the importance of taking a still image, screen capture device essentially on a film. You pause it, you take a picture, and you can take a picture of Moloch, a robot, and you can talk about how this android represents the fear of humans essentially merging with machines and losing their soul. You could use a still image to analyze the cinematography, the symbolism that is there. Another thing you can do in films, if you have like the Red Menace, is you pause the film, and during a critical scene, you would record the dialogue. And the dialogue would then, the transcript of it would be evidence that you could potentially incorporate into your paper. For instance, if you're exploring the naivety or the director's presentation of the naivety of Americans falling victim to communist propaganda, you could quote the dialogue to illustrate how the author is presenting this idea. And you can also analyze the cinematography. So, in other words, through the film as a whole, Fritz Lang is known for the light and dark and the backdrop. It doesn't look very sophisticated to us and with modern CGI, but for its time, with its models and everything else, it was it was really the first major science fiction film. So you could analyze the cinematography of the film as a whole. You could also do potentially a scene analysis rather than a still analysis of a particular image. You're analyzing a particular scene in the movie, like when Joe goes to the bar and is essentially beginning the process of turning him or recruiting him into the Communist Party. So you have, maybe a 5-minute clip, and you'd analyze the music, the motion of the characters, the expression of the actors' faces, all of that to essentially describe that scene, and then how that scene would have been interpreted by the audience, or what the director was trying to portray about communism in that particular scene. Now, when it comes to a film, like with a novel, the novel has a purpose, a meaning, something that the director wants you to think about. So one of the ways to think about what is the overall theme is to look at the plot. And if you analyze the plot of the film, it's often going to provide you with a clue as to what the director was intending to say. Cinema is made through constituent elements, like a novel is made through literary devices. Well, a film is made through cinematic devices, and one is an allegory. So the scene of the robot eating the workers, we don't have to dig too far to that, but that's the idea, essentially that capitalism is going to essentially eat the workers, and they become less than human. And this is a recurring motif. A motif is a kind of a recurring theme that is continually depicted. Something about gender, something about dehumanization of workers in Lang's film. So motif can be an area of focus. It's a recurring structural element in the novel that is a vehicle for the author to convey his theme. Another thing you can potentially look out is, outside of the film itself, what was the archaeology of its construction? Who financed it? Who was the script writer? What was going on in that society at a time? And you can look at the audience end as well. How would the audience have read the text? What were the reviews like? What was Weimar society like that was, watching this film? What were some of their triggers and some of their fears and anxieties, and how would these anxieties have been manifested in the film? So when we talk about deconstructing the film, what we're talking about is essentially breaking out a film into various smaller constituent elements and then analyzing them analytically, describing them, presenting still images, textual description, transcribing dialogue, and then analyzing it to reveal certain social discourses as to what was being conveyed by this film as a cultural representation about gender, class warfare, anxiety, anti-Semitism, whatever the case may be. One of the things we're going to be focusing on a little bit later is post-structuralism and cultural theory. So when we're looking at or analyzing a film or a cultural text or a comic book, this is essentially the vocabulary, the technical vocabulary that historians would use. Deconstruction refers to the process of interpreting any cultural text. Discourses are essentially clusters of meaning that are inside a society that are also represented inside a text. Fritz Lang may have had particular ideas that he wanted to convey into his masterpiece, but he was also reflecting deeper discourses in his society in terms of anxieties about revolution, the role of gender roles, etc. Another example of discourses would be, of course, if you have a propaganda film like Der Eeuwige Jude, the discourse is all about anti-Semitism, right? The state is trying to project its ideas about who the Jews were, trying to persuade the audience about that. Hegemony is essentially this term that we looked at earlier from Antonio Gramsci, and this is the idea that elites create cultural texts, films, propaganda films like Der Eeuwige Jude as a means to persuade the audience about their viewpoints. Semiotic analysis or cultural theory, cultural analysis, these are kind of terms that argue that any text is a symbol system, and that therefore one can deconstruct it or read it to analyze some of the discourses that are in society. In other words, this film is part of a larger Germany in the 1930s. It's part of the Nazi state, and its ideology is about race. And we can use this particular text, Der Eeuwige Jude, we could use propaganda posters, we could use comic books, and we can take one of these texts and to unpack it to show what the state was trying to persuade its audience to do. But whenever a state does this, it doesn't mean that the audience interpreted it the way that the state wanted. Many Germans weren't convinced. Many Americans may have shared the ideas about communist infiltration in the Red Menace, but it wasn't a good film, so they didn't necessarily go to the box office to watch it. So the important thing to remember here is that when it comes to meanings, often they are contested, and different groups might reject the labeling. So certainly any Jew that would have watched Derech Yehuda wouldn't have accepted this as reality. They would have been persuaded. They might have been traumatized by it. So the audience itself is going to assign or ascribe different meanings to a cultural text. So another thing you can do, most of you are probably going to analyze the construction of a text rather than the interpretation of the text by the audience, which is a more difficult form of analysis, probably outside the scope of this paper. So if you're looking at the inscription of discourses, what you're essentially trying to do is you're analyzing the text, and then you're kind of analyzing some of the ideas or theses that the author, the director, is conveying to the audience. Cultural reproduction is the idea that all these cultural texts are read by the audience and then internalized in various ways. So viewers to the Red Menace and other anti-communist propaganda would have internalized it. Their fear about Russian infiltration would have been amplified, so they might have been behaving in irrational ways. This is also connected to the idea of power. We'll look at Foucault a little bit later in the semester. But one of the ideas is, who is creating this text? Obviously, the Nazi state had a police state, so they were able to control the message, bleed out any alternative ideas, and powerfully inject their ideology into people's heads, particularly young children, particularly young boys in the Hitlerjugend. So social power is analyzing how cultural reproduction is controlled by dominant groups and how they inject discourses into the masses or marginalized groups so that they accept the reality, the injustices of society. Tropes is probably an idea that you might want to investigate or focus on. It's essentially a recurring motif in a text. So many of you are looking at landscape paintings. One of the motifs there is the Native American. Aboriginals are essentially often depicted as, or they're a symbol of an area being uncivilized. So one of the ways to say that this area is the frontier or it's wilderness is to show that there's not only not any trains or farms, but that there is this, aboriginal there. That's a sign, or that's a trope. It's a symbolic element to designate that this area is wilderness and it's not ruled by the laws of civilization. Okay, so that's it for data mining. Now I want to go to my main purpose, which is advanced argumentation. And it's really about synchronizing, tightening your arguments so that your thesis is persuasive. Now, before I get to argumentation, I want to illuminate my thesis as to why students often are not as successful at argumentation as they should be. And I think this has to do with how you're trained in terms in high school about how to write essays. So I want to distinguish two things to you, and I want you to keep this metaphor in mind and see if it's useful in terms of extracting argumentation from the writing process in general. So when it comes to any essay, you have to think about the essay having two skeletons. One skeleton is the structure of the essay as a set piece of writing, having an introduction, body, and conclusion. It has to be coherent. The prose has got to be clear. It's got to have narrative flow. You have to develop your writing voice. So that's one element or one skeleton of the essay, and most of you are very familiar with that. But there's a second skeleton as well, and this is the argumentation. Now, one of the ways I have tried to have students think about this is rather than think about this as a set piece of writing, picture yourself as a prosecutor. So O.J. Simpson is there. You know he's guilty. You've got the evidence. You've got to persuade the audience that this is guilty. And you're going to be successful, not whether you wrote a beautiful legal brief, but whether at the end of the day the jury votes to convict. And that is something different. Now, these two skeletons, they relate together. But if you focus just on the grammar and the structure and not on the argumentation, this is what results in your essay not being as good as it should, because it might structurally be okay, fine, but the arguments aren't tight enough. You haven't presented the exhibits and the subordinate arguments in a way to persuade the audience that your essay is less convincing than it should be. So let's start with a part that students are pretty familiar with. The essay is a set piece of writing, and one of the ways I would look at it is to define it as a genre. A genre means that as a formal piece of writing, there's explicit structural parts that have to be present. I've already talked about those, as well as there's certain informal conventions that governs how they are arranged. Another way to think about it is the essay is an organism or a body that's comprised of various organs. So if you don't have a heart, well, a circulatory system, nothing else functions. So that's why if there isn't a thesis statement, it's not an essay, because it just doesn't have that critical element there. It may be a paper, it may be a submission, it might be a piece of writing, but it's not an essay. So when we think about the essay or the student essay, in essence, it's an academic piece of writing. It's always a research paper, but it has certain structural elements. And, since it's written out, it has certain rules that have to be followed. That would be different than if you are giving an oral presentation, for example. There may be similarities in terms of introduction and thesis and exhibits, but how you communicate through an oral form and how you communicate through a poster or an essay are a little bit different. So, important thing to understand that if the essay is a genre, you have to understand what this genre is, what are the structural components, the rules for how they fit together, and understanding that is going to enable you to write a pure essay. Your audience is going to have certain expectations, and understanding those expectations, meeting those, is one of the critical jobs of writing an effective essay. Now, of any essay, there are certain structural components. So this table that you see here, this diagram, this is something that you already know was drilled into your head by your high school teachers. So at the 1000 level, I always see that the 5-paragraph essay, there's an introductory paragraph, there's 3 body paragraphs, and there is a conclusion. Now, as a very basic guide or map for an essay, the 5-paragraph format is okay, but it's just a very basic component. Obviously, within there's a lot of nuances that need to be done, especially at a university level and a history essay. So the introduction itself is not enough just to have an introduction. The introduction itself has got at least 7 important elements that have to be present. And if all of those elements are not well formed or not related together, then the essay is not effective. That's the science of writing. On the other hand, we've also talked about the art, that individual historians have an idiosyncratic style in the way that they arrange things. There's various ways that one can do that in a way that is acceptable from the scientific point of view, but also reflects your own particular style or purpose in writing that essay or the peculiarities of that project. So what are the structural components of the essay? Well, one of the things I should point out right away is that title is actually one. It might be the first thing that people read about your essay. So there's a certain strategy in terms of coming up with a title. Again, it's a little bit like the lead. It should perhaps be catchy, but it should also perhaps allude to what the paper is about, your historical question, the parameters of your data set. one of the popular conventions in history writing right now is essentially the main title and then the subtitle. The main title is maybe something catchy, a quotation. The subtitle is delimiting the historical context, so settling the American frontier from 1870 to 1892. Now, the introduction, as we say, there's various elements that have to be present. I just have a bare bones version here relative to the 7 essential elements. I just put 3 down. The body is essentially your evidence, right? This is the primary sources, the citations that are going to substantiate your subordinate arguments that validate your thesis statement. And then your conclusion is very important. It's often neglected and poorly done, which is one of the reasons for this particular workshop. And I'm going to talk more about the conclusion at the end. But the conclusion is not only a summary of what you did before, but it's very important that you highlight how this is the argumentation part really, but it's not only ending your essay, it's also showing why your findings are significant to historiography. And of course, the bibliography is very important because this tells us the sources that you looked at. Were the sources that you looked at appropriate or sufficient to, essentially validate your thesis? You might have argued that O.J. Simpson was guilty, but you didn't actually look or include the important evidence that put him on the scene. Therefore, your thesis would fail. So obviously, there are these structural components, and their arrangement is very important. What I'm going to focus on now is the kind of the second skeleton, which is the argumentation specifically. Now, it's important to point out that when it comes to the 2 skeletons, they're not apart. It's not like one part is the grammar and one part is the argumentation. They really come together. It's just that students in writing essays tend to focus too much on the genre or the structure of the essay and not enough on the argumentation. And by focusing on the argumentation, my argument is your essay will be stronger and a lot of the structural issues you may have been suffering will take care of themselves. So every essay is not just a genre, it is also an argument. And it's important to understand that an essay is an argument. Now, we talked earlier, history papers are not descriptive. I don't want you to tell me what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I can go to Wikipedia for that. That's just a catalog. That's encyclopedia entry. History papers are making arguments. They're analyzing particular problems. So they are arguments, and we need to understand these structural elements. And by polishing them in their purest form, arranging them together effectively, that's what makes it persuasive. So one of the ways to think about it is imagine that you're not writing an essay or writing a paper specifically, but imagine yourself as a prosecutor. So your case, in this case, is this historical problem, and your only objective is not to write an essay, not to write a 10-page paper or a term paper. Your only object, in terms of the argument, is to persuade the reader that your thesis is correct. And that is your only singular goal. Now, if we focus on the essay from that angle, what we can see on a very bare bones level is essentially the outline of an argument. What are these structural elements of the argument, and how do they fit into the structural elements of the genre of the essay? Well, the first thing is that, every historical paper that you write, you wrote it, you defined a historical problem, so you have to tell us what that is. This is the historical question that we need to answer. Then we need to know the data set. What evidence did you look at? And of course, one of the tests we have to go through is there enough evidence there that it can actually prove the question that you set out? That was one of the problems with the study design early in the semester. Then you have to have your argumentative thesis. So you can't have a descriptive thesis. It's going to be, I'm going to prove this. O.J. Simpson was guilty. Okay, so that sets up the standard. This is the barometer. Now we're going to look at the evidence. So subordinate arguments are very important. And again, usually history professors have so much material to go over, they don't focus a lot or have the time to dig into argumentation or the mechanics of essay writing. So that's why, these types of courses, these types of workshops are important. But a subordinate argument is essentially arguments that substantiate your thesis. So if you're arguing, for instance, that O.J. Simpson is guilty, one of your arguments is, well, he doesn't have an alibi. A second argument is there was this noise that was heard. And the third argument is that he had a very violent fight with his wife 2 days before. So these 3 points of evidence, circumstantial as they are, as the subordinate arguments, and then within them you have various exhibits or pieces of evidence, quotations, invoking sources that substantiate those subordinate arguments. So what you want to do, like a lawyer in a court, is to essentially, in a logical way, build up your case, presenting the evidence. So you want to organize it together. So you have, maybe 30 exhibits. And if you think about, your court case, which are the exhibits that are going to appeal to the audience? Which of them are absolutely key and essential? So I'm going to put a significant focus on them. And, how am I going to present them in a logical way that I'm building the case? So you start off usually with your weakest point of evidence, or you're setting the stage. O.J. Simpson didn't have an alibi. That doesn't mean he killed him. It just means he can't prove he wasn't there. And then you start to put him on the scene. Oh, well, there was this noise. Oh, and then he had a motive. And then you present the evidence for that. Sometimes the evidence or an exhibit can be used for more than one subordinate argument. Sometimes you have more evidence than you can include because of the scope of the paper. That's fine. That's where outlining the argument is very important. So at the end of your subordinate arguments, whether it's 3, 4, or 5, you've presented your entire case. Now the case is there, the evidence is there. Now you have to go to this final ritual, and this is what the conclusion is, where you got to show what you proved and convince the audience that your thesis was correct. Now, in terms of a history essay, what you usually do is you recapitulate your thesis, and then you show how your findings challenge the historiography, elaborated on the historiography in various ways. So one of the ways that helps students to visualize effective argumentation is to see it. That's why I encourage you, look at historical articles in history journals, even articles of your professors. If you have a particular professor that you like, I've taken all his courses, well, get an article of his and see why you like him. Or if there's a particular historian where it just resonates with you, deconstruct how they are setting up the introduction. Learn the keys. This is their individual voice, but they're also masters of the historical craft. And what can you glean by showing how these structural elements are formed and how they are related together? So again, this is a very simplistic introductory paragraph. I think for your essays, which are essentially 7 to 8 pages at most, your introduction will probably just be a paragraph long, rather than having them be 2.5 pages like some of them that you submitted to me. Strip it down. Think about it not as an introduction, as an essay or as a paper. Strip it down to an argument, because every introduction is in essence a mini capsule of your argument as a whole. You're not going to tell all the evidence you're going to produce, but you're going to explain to the reader what your case is. So it's in a micro form, essentially, what your historical question is, what the context is, and what your argument is. So in this particular example, what I've done is I've used historiography of the big shift in Cold War historiography in the last 20 years as a kind of a lead to kind of set the context. Then I explain that I'm going to apply this historiography to Canada, and a particular case study, the United States relationship, or the Canada's relationship with the United States during the early Cold War. Then you explain your historical question, and then you show what other historians have said about this topic, and then you're going to explain what your case study can tell us about and challenge the historiography that was before. So one of the ways to think about if you're trying to streamline your introduction is take out any unnecessary verbiage and just leave the bare bones argumentation there. What is your historical question? What is your data set? What is your thesis? Now, as I said, students really can learn from concrete examples. So one type of sentence that's important on primary source research papers is explaining the relevance of the data set. So you chose a case study. Why did you choose this case study? What can this case study tell us? So I want to give you some examples of these type of data set relevance sentences that might be featured in an introduction. During the winter term of 2016, student researchers from the University of Ottawa collected oral histories from 60 alumni that attended the university during the 1960s. Okay, so this tells us this is an oral history data set. There's the data set size is 60 people. These were all alumni of the University of Ottawa. It's a very clear exhibit of what the data set is, and people can draw their own conclusions about whether it's sufficient to answer or to answer the historical question and to validate your thesis. Okay, data set 2. Editorials from the Fulcum and Rotonde from 1966 to 1970 provide a great insight upon how students in Canada experienced and reacted into the Vietnam War. So in other words, during the 1960s, there were 100,000 students at the University of Ottawa. We couldn't necessarily consult them all. How are we going to figure out how these students back 60 years ago were looking at the Vietnam War? Well, the data set in this case to look at this is to look at the French language, English language journal, and to see what they say, and to see perhaps if Francophones and Anglophones were looking at the Vietnam War in a different lens. Historians have long used Der Eeuwige Jude as the text to examine Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda. Commissioned by Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda himself, the film was a sophisticated attempt to appeal to the German population's subconsciousness and radicalize their anti-Semitic prejudices in tune with Nazi ideological principles. So this is explaining, this was this film, and I'm going to be looking at this film, and I'm going to be particularly looking at how the film was appealing to subconscious prejudices, which maybe people have looked at this film for all kinds of different ways. I'm going to be looking particularly at that because I'm interested at how they use these subconscious impulses to promote anti-Semitism. Now it's building up to the thesis statement. It's not yet there, but it does explain. Nazi anti-Semitism is well known. We knew the Nazi state was doing this in various stages. They had various programs. This is showing you what this analysis can tell us about the Nazi program for anti-Semitism. One of the things that's very important when you're doing a scientific form of analysis is that you don't overrepresent the evidence. In fact, you have to qualify the evidence and to ascertain variables in the data set, interpretive challenges that may have to be overcome. So oral history is a well-known example of this. You're dealing with witnesses that may have experienced something 40 years ago. So how reliable is this type of memory? And what techniques could an oral historian use to kind of cross-reference, verify this, to help people to recall these events? So when you're dealing with an oral history data set, you'd probably want to have a paragraph where you explain your research techniques, the type of questions you were asking, the way that people were responding, areas of discomfort, and how you navigated with that. That just explains the nature of the study. It's not just enough to say, okay, we interviewed these 60 people if we don't know what the methodology was that you were using. So you have to talk about the nature of the evidence. And this goes for anything. If you're looking at, declassified CIA documents, you have to say, well, I wish some of this wasn't redacted, because who is this person number A that America was backing even before Lumumba was, president? The other thing is, okay, I have these sources here, but they're not being open about what they discussed, which was killing Lumumba, because they didn't want to have it in the record, because they knew that would be bad. So they wanted to give the president plausible liability. So how do I interpret the circumstantial evidence to interpret the idea that I think Eisenhower gave his kill order at this NSC meeting, or at least this order was interpreted this way by the CIA director? So you have to be open about the suppositions you make and the potential of missing evidence or other hypotheses that could also be obtained relative to ambiguous or incomplete evidence. So one of the ways you can add nuance or qualification to your data set is by including a short sentence in your introduction or a sentence in your methodological or data set paragraph. Obviously, sometimes the data isn't complete. That's why historians can disagree. They're looking at different data. You have to make sure the data set was sufficient, that you had enough of a basis to support a hypothesis about Weimar culture. If you only looked at one source, how do we not know it's idiosyncratic? How do we know it reflects everything else? So you have to corroborate it by looking at other paintings that can also affirm your ideas about how Western painters looked at the frontier during the 1870s. The data set may not be sufficiently focused. So in other words, you looked at landscape paintings from 1700 to 1900. Well, that's way too long a range. Or you compared paintings of Africa, Australia, and Canada, and you didn't in any way account for that. Even though these were different environments and the people going there might have been inspired by different artistic traditions and the frontiers were different, can you just put that data together without any kind of explanation or any kind of way of accounting for such differences? So I'm going to provide you some examples of these type of qualifying sentences, and expressing nuance or providing room that you're not saying, well, this is the gospel truth. I mean, this is what I came to after looking at all the evidence, but there's still some uncertainty there. This data suggests is a qualifying word, that Canadian hippies did not view marijuana smoking as a progressive act or its usage as taking part in a broader counterculture movement. So, one of the ideas would be, in our society, drug taking is a big subversive act. You're really flaunting social rules. But there was less of a stigma or taboo with marijuana during the 1960s. And, obviously when you have 60 interview subjects, not all of them had smoked marijuana, not all of them saw the same thing. But what you're discovering and talking to these people is that, well, taking marijuana wasn't seen as a very transgressive act. It wasn't something where you could really get in trouble with your parents for most people in most families. While the sample size was small, the data hints that historians need to explore the divide between metropolitan and rural communities. So if you're looking at, for instance, 60 alumni of the University of Ottawa, and 20 of those were from rural communities where their view of the counterculture movement was very different from those that were living in cities. We had outdoor concerts and some of the fads and draft dodgers were present. What you're alluding to is that the size was small, But man, I'm seeing a very strong indication that in rural Ontario, the 1960s was very different than it was in Ottawa and Montreal and some of these metropolitan centers. While historians have noted that oral histories are subject to certain biases, what is compelling in this case is how the testimonials confirm the views expressed in contemporary print sources. So what you're saying is, yeah, oral history can be unreliable. That's well known. Here it's shown in the research. This is the methods that we use to try to make it as reliable as possible. But what we found is entirely consistent with the scholarly literature. It's entirely consistent with other primary sources. That gives us a high degree of confidence that our hypothesis, our findings are correct. Another type of sentence you might want to include into your introductory paragraph, again, relative to the nuance of argumentation, is to explain your method. Now, you often don't include that because many of you, when you're writing a paper, probably 80-85% of the time, your paper is either going to be a historiographical paper or it's going to be dealing with written text. So in other words, if your primary sources are all written texts, your method is essentially the historical default, which is historical criticism, looking critically at the primary source and recording some of the things that are written there. So in that sense, your method might be implicit, and you wouldn't necessarily state it as it would be obvious when you would say what your data set is. But what happens if you're doing film analysis or painting analysis or song analysis or oral history? Well, then those methodological questions are a lot more significant. And you need to explain what method you're going to use of, maybe 10 or 12 methods that you potentially could have used, and what the legitimacy of that particular method is, and why you chose it relative to other alternatives. So if you're using eyewitness testimony, which is essentially oral history, you would have to provide a rationale for how this is important, because this doesn't survive in any other way. It's only by going below, to doing the history from below and talking to these people that we understand what the experience was like in Brampton in the late 1960s. If your approach is microhistory, I'm going to look at these little biographies. There's a rationale for that because it can provide us these, in-depth textual clues that you wouldn't get from any other source, maybe even newspapers or magazines. We don't know how people interpreted those and lived the 1960s. So this makes microhistory the only way that one can really explore this type of cultural history. I won't go through all the sentences. You can pause it and look at that, but these are just examples of methodological sentences. One of the things we looked at was mentalite history, reconstructing the experience. If that is your particular method, what you could do is, essentially say, I looked at these oral histories to describe the worldview of people in Ontario during the 1960s. Now, I think for this particular essay, probably one paragraph as your entire introduction works well because it is a relatively short essay. But if you're writing a term paper, which may be 25 pages, it's pretty similar to a professional journal article. So in that case, your introduction may be more than one paragraph, and some of those structural elements that were just one sentence in a short essay now become an entire paragraph long. If you're doing an advanced research paper, for example, you might have an entire paragraph on your data set explaining what the data set is and the way that you interpret it. You might have an entire historiography paragraph where you go to the literature review that has been done to provide the context for your own study. You might have a whole methodological paragraph with, these were the sources and this is how I extracted the data from the data set and used it to substantiate my thesis. So, this is probably not relevant to you, but I'm going to go over it because you are going to write more advanced research papers as you go on in the university, and you need to be aware that, these structural elements can be arranged differently. So for many professional journal articles, the introduction will be in a 4-paragraph form, and this is a version of it. I think the Grabowski article I showed you earlier, that was essentially the version that was being used. And when you have that longer structure, having the thesis statement as the last sentence of your introductory paragraph is no longer a hard and fast rule. In fact, one of the techniques that we often see is that the thesis will be kind of explained in stages, or what I call a hybrid or complex thesis statement. The lead will often provide a clue to the thesis. Often the last sentence of the first paragraph will be the thesis, or it can also be the last sentence of the fourth or last paragraph as well. In other words, there's variations on how to do it, and this is where the science becomes art, and it becomes relative to the paper that you're writing, your style. There's different ways to skin the cat, so to speak. Now, what are these elements? Now, essentially, you need to have an introduction to explain to the reader what you are researching, what your case study is, and why it is significant. The literature review paragraph is describing previous research. The case study paragraph is explaining what your data set consists of, why you chose it, what some of the methodological issues is. Or the methodological could be part of the case study, or it could be a part as well. So I'm not going to read this sentence out, but you can pause the video and read it yourself. But this is a great historiographical contextualization paragraph. So if you have an introduction which explains what your study is to the reader, it can be followed. This is a very common format with a historiography contextualization paragraph. So this is the problem I'm investigating now. This is what historians have said about the broader subject as a whole. And that's going to be followed by your case study paragraph. Just look at this in general. I think it's doing a very good job of laying out the land and broader trends and scholarships during the 1980s, and then relating it more specifically to empire and in particular conclusions that were reached. And it's really setting out the subject. It's both historical and historiographical contextualization. A reader would have a very good idea about how this case study fits into the literature that already exists. So a lot of these examples I'm giving you are from other student papers. So I think this really helps you as a student writer to see what other students have done, what excellence is. Excellence as recognized as being published in CLIO, the Student Undergraduate Journal. So we talked about the historiographical paragraph. What about the case study paragraph? Many of you are doing, for instance, paintings of the frontier in various places. This is a good example of historical contextualization. The settlement of the frontier had a different chronology, a different backstory, a different colonial context in America, Canada, Australia, Africa. So what you need to do is to kind of relate your data set of paintings that you're looking at, these parameters, to historical chapters of the settlement of the frontier. The settlement of the upper Midwest was very different from the settlement of the dryland West, and the way that painters approached it was very different. So what Maya does very good here is to essentially explain the chapters of Western settlement and the main eras of that, and this is going to explain how she's going to choose her data set in terms of two different eras and comparing them. So what you don't want to do, or what you can't do, is just to have 8 random paintings, right? You have to have a rationale for why you chose this as your data set, and you want to link the data set to the historical chapters of the frontier that you are studying. Now, the most important part of your essay, you've probably heard this said 1,000 times, and it's both true and not true. It's true in the sense, of course, it's true. It's obvious. I mean, your thesis is your most important thing. I think where you can misinterpret that is I've seen many papers that have a great thesis statement, but their paper really isn't that good because although the thesis statement is I mean, great as a piece of prose, it doesn't lead to an argument or convincing evidence. So it's important to understand with thesis formulation that the thesis statement is part of a larger thing called the thesis, which is your argument as a whole. And although it's very important to have a very well-written thesis statement, it can only be as strong as the argument as a whole. Now, the thesis formulation is usually a process that you go over the whole semester. This is what research is. You immerse yourself into the topic, you think, you consult the data, you consult the literature, and it's almost like a sculptor, Michelangelo. Before he did David, there was a block of marble. Then he began the process of bringing a humanoid form, and then he did the fine chiseling to create this beautiful, male body. So in a way, your thesis formulation is like Michelangelo. You're going through the process of the semester. You start off with a general topic, you have a working hypothesis, you select a data set, then you refine your thesis as you find that your data set is revealing some things you didn't expect, so you have to shift your thesis. And then you have your final thesis statement. After you've really completed the paper, I can't tell you how often this happens. When I've completed the reading, I go back to the thesis statement. It's the last thing I change because in the process of writing it, it now is being essentially nuanced, changed, shifted just a little bit to better align to the subordinate arguments and my concluding arguments there. So that's a normal process. When it comes to your thesis, your argumentation over the semester, you're in the process of chiseling it down to its final, perfect Platonic form. So one of the ways we have to think about thesis statements is, what is more effective? So we can use concrete models to compare and contrast it. Again, it's science and art. Some people like something more punchy. Some people like it more complex. What makes these two thesis sentences good? Which one is better? A is, this paper analyzes how der Jude projected anti-Semitic tropes. Now, I like it because it's short, but it's not an argumentative thesis. It's a functional thesis. It tells us that you're going to analyze the Jude. Well, yes, that's true, but you have to make an argument about how Jude promoted anti-Semitism. That's the argument you have to make. Now, as a sentence earlier in the introduction, setting the stage for your thesis, it might be a perfectly fine sentence. But as a thesis statement itself, it's a descriptive thesis. The motif of rats was a central vehicle for subconscious suggestion. Der Jude made clever use of various cinematic devices to connect the audience's instinctual repulsion with the Weimar's ever-present rodents to the Nazi argument that Jews were subhuman parasites that threatened the German nation. Now, that is a good thesis in the sense that it creates a clear argument, what you're going to look at, what you're going to prove. As a thesis statement, you might determine that this is too long. You want to break it up into constituent elements and maybe have something shorter as your thesis statement. And again, it's a way of finding your way through the paper, thinking about your voice, what works for your paper. Remember, it has to be an argumentative thesis, though. So we'll play a little game again, A or B. Although much evidence remains circumstantial, juxtaposing declassified CIA records with those of the Eisenhower administration suggests that September represented the turning point where the CIA moved to remove Lumumba based on their assessment that as a left-wing nationalist, he risked evolving into Africa's Castro. So one of the documents actually alludes to that. I think it's Alan Dulles that's speaking. Okay, so that's obviously a very long thesis. Is it too long? I think it's relatively clear. It presents a clear presents a clear thesis to defend. Alternative 2 is Eisenhower issued a kill order for Lumumba because the security establishment feared he would evolve into another Castro. Now, I think even though all the evidence up here is relevant, and that may be something to include in your introductory paragraph somewhere, it's always good if you have a succinct thesis statement, because if your reader, again, the purpose of the introduction is to set up the table, to explain to the reader what this study is about. If you send them down a rabbit hole, a long sentence with many clauses, they could become lost, or they might have to read it again. It's not that any of this detail is not significant. It might be very significant. But in terms of your thesis statement, what you want to have in the reader's mind is, okay, this is what I'm going to prove. OJ was guilty. That's very clear. This is very convoluted. So the basic idea is that the American security establishment feared that Lumumba would become a Castro. That's why they got rid of him. Isn't that communicated here? So is that a more effective thesis statement, even if it includes a lot less information? That's very relevant, but it's maybe not germane to your purpose, which is to set out to the reader clearly what you're setting out to prove. Now, one of the things that isn't done enough by students and not emphasized enough by professors in general is outlining arguments. How does one do it? Why is it important? Etc. Now, obviously, if you're writing a one-page reflection essay, maybe you don't have to outline your argument, although even in that case, I think it is useful. So I was talking earlier about how the thesis is the thesis statement, how as it relates to the subordinate arguments which present the evidence, the exhibits that are going to substantiate the subordinate arguments, and subordinate arguments that support the thesis statement. One of the things that I think is useful to do is to write out in full all of your subordinate arguments, because if you have immersed yourself in the data set, you already know what the evidence is, but it's too inchoate. You have all these different points of evidence. It's like the forest for the trees. So what you need to go is from the data mining step to the outlining step. And this is about refining your subordinate arguments. The subordinate arguments are the individual arguments that are going to substantiate the thesis, and they have the evidence, the exhibits behind them. So one of the things that I would recommend you doing is to spend about 10 minutes. That's really all it's going to take if you've mastered your data set in the scholarly literature. The next step from data mining to writing your essay is to outline the subordinate arguments. So you would start by writing your thesis statement out in full. And again, I've been challenging you in class, what is your thesis statement? What's your historical question? If you can't name it off the top of your head, you're not yet at the stage of writing your essay. And what this formal exercise will do by forcing you to write out your subordinate arguments is to similarly bring to the surface the key points of argument that will help you to organize the data into exhibits to substantiate your thesis. So in this particular case, I come up with essentially 5 subordinate arguments. I didn't put the thesis statement here, but you should have that at the top. Relative to your findings about this topic and the historical questions, these are relevant arguments. Europeans traveling to the frontier in 1850 had never encountered any environments resembling that of the dryland West. So they might have grown up in Sweden or Germany, then they moved to the East Coast, a very similar environment. They'd never been into kind of the dryland West across the 110th meridian. So it was an environment they didn't know, and it was, in a sense, shocking to them, and they were trying to figure out as painters how to capture this nature. In painting the West, American artists imagined wilderness as nature without any traces of civilization. So in other words, the artists that came there had, as cultural agents, they had been immersed in Western ideas about nature. And for them, they had this catalog of, this binary opposition, civilized versus uncivilized. And when they came to the Americas and they found an area where there was no human settlement, essentially it was, just, animals living there, they called that wilderness. And wilderness had a particular signification. It was the opposite of civilization. It was a state of nature. So in other words, what you're arguing is that, these ideas that Western thinkers inherited from the Enlightenment and Judeo-Christian tradition essentially shaped what they saw when they looked out at the world. Influenced by Arcadian ideas about nature's revitalizing powers, Western intellectuals imagined the pastoral landscape of the countryside as the ideal escape from the commotion of the industrial city. So in other words, a lot of Western painters coming from Europe, their basis or their attitudes about nature were shaped about living in a world where nature was being damaged. There was belching factories and woods were cutting down. And as a result, as the city became unnatural, the industrial slum, and they saw the countryside transform, they started to worry about losing their sense of self. And they started to, in this environment, the city and all the life, they started to feel it was important to go to their estate, to relax, to detach from the combustion of the industrial society. So this idea of nature as escape was something that they also brought over to the New World, where there really weren't industrial cities in the same sense. So how did that translate? Native Americans were a trope that artists imprinted upon their painting of a landscape to signify that they were untouched by civilization. So they had an idea of wilderness. If they looked at a landscape and there was no house, there was no road, there was no railroad, there was no telegraph line, then it was wilderness. And what did they use? Well, they used this symbol to show that this was wilderness, and they would put a Native American in there, right? So that would be their symbol for saying this was a wilderness. Western artists treated European and Native American subjects in different ways. Aboriginal Canadians were iconographically constructed as savages, unclothed and living in the imaginary state of nature. So taking these ideas from the Enlightenment and the state of nature, Rousseau, these were people that were living in harmony with nature. They hadn't been distanced from nature by civilization. Essentially, what Canadian artists did is they didn't depict Native Americans as they really were. They weren't even really interested in them. They didn't really talk to them. They couldn't speak their language. They had this preconceived idea of civilization versus uncivilized. And there was this whole iconography through which they showed, okay, this person is a savage because they didn't have clothes, they were hunting, these were all part of the baggage, the trope of saying, okay, this person is not civilized, they're not European. Now, in the process of writing out, see all these subordinate arguments, you might start to move things around. Okay, this point is really point one, and this is a separate point. But what you're basically doing is you're arranging a lot of your subordinate arguments in paragraphs. Again, there's two skeletons, the argument and the paragraphs of your body. And in a second stage, once you've gone through this exercise and say, well, these are the main arguments I want to carry, then you start to link them to particular points of evidence or exhibits to illustrate this. Okay, so the secondary literature is talking a lot about, Europeans and what they believed about nature and how these ideas influence artists. Okay, these were the artists that I consulted. This was the biography of these people, and this shows us that they were doing this. And then when it comes to the painting, well, okay, I have painting A, B, and C that illustrate this. This artist was spent a little bit more time in the frontier. He actually lived with Native Americans, so he had a different way of presenting them because it wasn't just a projection of an icon of the savage. He actually had an understanding of their way of life and how it fit in. So then you start to arrange the evidence there, and then in the second step, what you essentially have is you have an outline of your paper. In a way, that the paper will write itself from this outline. So a few of you are analyzing Metropolis, so I'm not going to read out again all the examples, but this is again the similar exercise. Depending on what your paper topic is, what you can do is write out some of these subordinate arguments in full. With a word processor, you can change the text, you can sharpen the language. You can move ideas around, put it this or there. What you're doing is mastering your data set, and you're beginning the process of creating your argument, your persuasion that your thesis is correct. One other thing that outlining is important for is, always with an essay assignment, there's a page limit or there's a word limit. And, often you're not in a court case going to present all the evidence that you have. You're just going to, present your really important stuff. And there's certain critical arguments that have to be made. So how are you setting them up? So first, when you start brainstorming, you maybe just write, a bunch of ideas on the page, and then you sharpen the prose, and you move them around, and then, that's the process through which you start to outline your argument. And then you start to incorporate the evidence, and that's how the paper gets written from the bottom up. Now, one of the things that can happen if you are formally writing out your subordinate arguments is that you might start with 3 or 4 and then realize, well, that's not really enough. Or maybe you come up with 20, and you realize, well, that's too many for a 7 or 8 page paper. But some of the subordinate arguments that you come up with are subordinate of subordinate arguments. So they're ancillary arguments. So you have your main arguments you have to make, and related to that, there's ancillary arguments. But I think it's useful when you start out as a first exercise is just to write out all the arguments about interesting things about your topic that are related in various ways to your thesis statement. And then the second stage, after kind of just brainstorming, is arrange them in a logical coherence. That's where the A papers distinguish themselves from the B papers, and I think this formal exercise is important. One of the things that's very important in essays are what I call transition sentences. So they're the first sentence of a paragraph that sets the stage for what that paragraph is about. It flashes it to the reader. Okay, they're often the transition sentences. If it's a new paragraph, it could be a subordinate argument, or it could be setting up, this is the exhibit. So I'm going to be looking at this painting. So what is an effective transition sentences? I've found that one of the reasons why structurally many student essays are discursive, or why the arguments don't flow well, is that it is a mechanical issue with poorly formulated transition sentences. Often there's a lot of redundancy in, I'm going to say this. So what you never want to do is say, well, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this. And then say in the next paragraph, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this. There's a simple rule for this that my college professors told me, and it's, tell me, don't show me. So don't say, I'm going to show you this painting, and this painting is going to show this. You simply go in and say, well, Fritz Lang's film focuses significantly on the dehumanization of workers. Okay, that's a good transition sentence. And then you're going to go on and say, well, in this scene, Fritz Lang does this. And if we look at this scene, we see this, and that shows this. So these are examples from Clio students in effective transition sentences. Again, transition sentences, I'm defining them very broadly as the first sentence of your paragraph. Every paragraph that follows has to be part of the sequence of argumentation building your case. If we don't understand the jump, why are we in this paragraph, or you're sending us through a bunch of prose or a philosophical statement, all that's doing is you're essentially throwing a bunch of dust in our path or a bunch of oil on the road, and you're making it harder for the reader to follow your argument. What you want to do is to have a clear pathway that every paragraph you understand what the purpose is, how this argument fits into your thesis statement. That's why transition sentences are so critical. So I want to read you a few, and I want you to think and work on that when you're writing your essay. Go to every first sentence of of any new paragraph, and is that transition sentence as effective as it should be? Because it has to be very important to explain to the reader what you set out to do in that paragraph. Although African leaders were often economically pressured into accepting unfavorable or semi-favorable aid agreements from the superpowers, they were not idle victims or bystanders in the Cold War. So that's challenging the conventional wisdom. That's interesting, very effective lead or transition sentence. What we're going to find now are some examples, I imagine, of various African nationalist leaders and some of the ways that they related and manipulated the superpowers for their own benefit. In the last 4 decades, the analysis of culture of empire has flourished. Travelogues recorded by hunters, tourists, and explorers are critical texts scholars use to probe the previously neglected connections between empire, Victorian culture, masculinity, hunting, and ecology. Now, it's very dense, but it's very clear as well. Aidan has a kind of a very technical style. He's got a very good vocabulary. So it might be difficult to unpack, but on the other hand, it is very clear. It's not empty like social, economic, situation. He's always concrete. The connections between these texts and empire and what was being explored, Victorian culture, masculinity, hunting, and ecology. These are all very different subjects. So that's pretty effective. What you want to avoid is what I often see in 1,000 level papers, empty philosophical statements or truisms. I'll often see in a paper 8 times, well, the Cold War was between the United States and the Soviet Union. Well, yeah, everyone knows that. You don't have to say that. If you're throwing that into a paragraph, what you're doing is essentially throwing a wrench into the gears, and your reader's left confused. Well, what is coming next? What was the point of saying that? So avoid broad generalization, sweeping generalization. Effective transition sentence has got to have a purpose, and it's got to be concrete. Okay, well, I'm not going to read this whole thing out, these 2 paragraphs, but obviously in the body, what makes for a good body paragraph? These are, again, your exhibits. So you need to have a good transition sentence. This is the evidence I'm going to present to you. And you have to understand, okay, well, this evidence relates to the subordinate argument, right? And then you essentially extrapolate on it. So this was the book that I'm talking about. This is the painting. This is the scene I'm talking about. You describe that scene, and then you show how it is representing the subordinate argument that you illustrated earlier. So if you want to see a concrete example, this is Aidan Elliott again on his paper monograph of the pen. It's looking at one of these big game hunters who was often not considered one of the canons of the travelogues, but which he's highlighting actually was one of the founders of this genre. He hasn't been recognized in that way. In that sense, it's, I guess, a kind of a revisionist thesis. So you can pause the video and read how he's doing it mechanically. Potentially you could take notes and identify particular sentences, analyze what makes it effective. Or even, it's maybe not perfect. Maybe it doesn't quite fit your style. How would you have done it? How could this maybe be improved? Through deconstruction, looking at concrete text, this is how we learn. This is how we get to be better essay writers, better arguers. So here's a good example from Maya's paper. Again, she had, I think, 8 or 10 paintings. Most paintings got a single paragraph treatment. So her structure was, to deal with every painting as an individual piece. And what you're doing with this primary source analysis is, you're explaining the painting, what it is, who painted it, why, what it captures, why it is significant, how it fits into the subordinate argument. So what you can see is that she does this effectively. You can imagine other paragraphs that are similar to this. This could be a method that you could use. If you're doing film deconstruction, you could do 4 or 5 scenes in paragraphs of this form. So I'm looking at this scene here, and this is what is happening in this scene. And if you look at this cinematic device and this cinematic device, what you see is, Lang is really exhibiting some of the contemporary anxieties about, how technology is a dehumanizing force. So a conclusion is very important. I find that in many essays, it's one of the weakest parts of your essay. And this is unfortunate because it is the final word, right? So this is, even if you have a good thesis statement, if you don't have a good conclusion, then you're not persuading your audience that your thesis statement is correct. So we need to focus a little bit more on the conclusion, what needs to be done structurally inside it. So one good way to begin your conclusion, I think, is just to recapitulate your thesis in one way. You're looping back to the introduction. You've just gone through all these exhibits and all the details. So you have to go back, to the forest from the trees and say, okay, this was my thesis. O.J. Simpson was guilty. And then, you have to say why this was significant. This is a history essay. So what were your findings? And, why were these findings significant? Did it challenge the conventional wisdom of historiography in any way? Maybe it argues that, the historiography needs to be revised, or it provides a new data set that's never been looked at before, and it provides new evidence that maybe substantiates what historian had argued. So essentially what you need to do, absolutely essential, is you need to relate the thesis to the historiography. There's a lot of other things, that could be into conclusion as well. I think generally shorter is better. And I think for most of your essays, a 1-paragraph conclusion will be sufficient. I'll show you some examples in just a minute. But what you also might include is some of these things that we noted into the introduction. Since the conclusion is the mirror of the introduction, you might potentially lay out future paths for research based on what you found. Well, historians haven't looked at this enough. We should look at this more. This is one data set. These are some, there's many other data sets that could be looked at that we get a clearer picture. You might look at, some unresolved questions in the oral history. We couldn't quite, figure out this problem. We had some evidence here. So you explain, the circumstantial nature of your conclusions or qualify them in various ways. Or you could, say the limits of the case study. Like, I looked at the Congo, but, sub-Saharan Africa was over 60 states, and, I can't look at all of them. Was this true for all of them? Well, I think, relative to the historiography, we think this is a pretty good conclusion. But, it's just the Congo for this period of time. There were some unique things here that may not have been apparent in all the other case studies. And then the final word is a little bit like the lead. It's the last sentence. Right. So this is the last thing that someone's going to read. So what is going to be effective there? Think about it in that way. Spend some time on that last sentence. This is your final word. Often a good trick is to go back to your title page, so you make a full circle, right? Or go back to your thesis again. Or just leave the author with a final thought about how your thesis was significant or how it resonates with an important contemporary issue. And anyway, it's important to have that last word or that final sentence well crafted. So here I've included Maya's conclusion paragraph. So she starts off with, historiography. And she summarizes, some of the findings of the literature. And in the second paragraph, she elaborates on her thesis and how her thesis was historically significant for understanding the colonial process. So I think this is a model conclusion. Again, I would encourage you to pause, read it, analyze it in detail, think about your own paper. What is going to be an effective conclusion? How are you going to summarize the findings and relate them to historiography? How are you going to relate it back to your thesis statement? How are you going to persuade the audience? There's different ways to skin a cat, but in general, that is what a conclusion needs to do. And no essay can be effective if you don't have a conclusion, because that's where the thesis statement is, persuading the audience that the thesis statement is correct. If you fail here on the last mile, you don't cross the finish line. So the conclusion is very important, and you're going to have another last assignment to hand in for that purpose. So the final thing I wanted to talk about was effective titles. And often you start off with a title or a preliminary title, or maybe you don't. I often find that my title comes kind of like my thesis statement at the end. Sometimes I struggle for a long time until I find it. In a way, an essay will write itself, right? Because we're empiricists. We go into the data, we report the findings. In the process of presenting the findings, we reveal the thesis statement. It comes to life, like Michelangelo will expose it from the marble of the rock. In a way, the title is like that as well. In terms of effective titles, it's usually something snappy. Players, not pawns, is the idea that, third world leaders were not simply pawns on the superpower chessboard, but they could play the game as well and manipulate their superpower patrons. So players, not pawns, is suggesting the thesis, is a very important revisionist thesis. And then it explains, okay, I'm going to be rethinking kleptocracy during the late Cold War. So it's kleptocracy, it's Africa, it's late Cold War. You're referencing in times and space. Maya does it more specifically. So it's this particular time period, 1841 to 1893. Frederick Jackson Turner, the closing of the frontier. 1841, I think, is the beginning of the Oregon Trail. So those are very important dates that sends a message to historians about what you're looking at. Aiden's title is Monarch of the Pen. So he's talking about, it's a biography of William Cornwallis as an archetype for the big game hunter literature. Okay, so this was my workshop. I think one of the benefits of having it recorded is that you can kind of freeze frame it, go back, refer to it. I've tried to talk extensively about some of the nuances about argumentation. It's really that which you have to master to become an A-level essay writer. My idea was to break down particular parts of the argument to highlight all the structural elements that might be there, and as well as to give you concrete examples so you can see, relative to the art of the essay writing, what might work for your particular project, what works or conforms to your historical voice or style.